We'll speak about this a little bit later in the Parsha, but the Gemara explains a concept which is based on the verse in the Torah. God says, I will bring blessing into your silo, meaning when you bring in the harvest and you have all the grain, I will bring blessing into your silo. What does this mean? In Hebrew, the word silo is basomecho, asomecho. In Hebrew, there are two ways one is able to say a person who's blind. Either iver is a blind person in Hebrew, or suma. A person is suma means his eyes are sealed. He cannot see. So the Gemara explains when it says, I will bring brocha basamecho, eina brocha cholo, ela dovar asomi min ayin. Blessing could only come about upon something that's concealed from the human eye. If it's obvious to the human eye, blessing cannot come on it. It's only if it's concealed. What does this mean? So the Gemara explains that a person is a farmer, he brings in his harvest. And before he quantifies the harvest, he's not sure how many bushels he has. And he prays to God. He says, it should be the will of God that blessing should come upon my harvest. So when he's supplicating for that blessing, we're not sure what exactly the quantity of that harvest is. It's a valid request, supplication. Why? Because at that point, it's an unknown quantity, and an unknown quantity, blessing could come upon. But he first quantifies the harvest. He has 1,000 bushels, and he has the supplication, the tefillah, the prayer, that God should bring blessing upon his 1,000 bushels. It's considered tefillah shov. It's a supplication in vain, has no value. Because blessing could only come upon something which is an unknown quantity. And something which is weighed, measured, or counted, blessing cannot come upon it. That's the Talmud in two locations. The question is why? If blessing could come upon something which is concealed, not quantified, why can't blessing come upon something which is quantified? So the Maral of Prague explains, what is the concept? What is the concept of blessing? Blessing is a spiritual force. What's the difference between the physical and the spiritual? In the spiritual realm, in the physical realm, everything is finite. In the spiritual realm, it's unlimited. A blessing, the core of a blessing emanates from the spiritual of a person, and God's blessing. And blessing is something spiritual. For instance, if a person asks for blessing, he says, you should be blessed. You should be blessed. To what degree should I be blessed? Blessed. Unlimited. So blessing has relevance to the unlimited. The moment you quantify something and you want a spiritual effect to come upon something which is in a different realm of classification, has no relevance to it. So before you quantify the harvest, with the harvest, it's not finite because it's unknown. It's an unknown quantity. Blessing, which also is unlimited, has relevance to it. Therefore, when you pray that the blessing should come upon it, it could increase. Although it's less, it could become more. But once you've quantified it and you have a number what it is, and it's finite, blessing no longer has relevance to it. As a result of that, it's considered a supplication in vain. That's the Maral of Prague's explanation of this particular Gemara, which says that before one quantifies something, that's when you pray. Afterwards, it's not going to help any longer. So I asked the question, and this is really an introduction to what we're speaking about. After the second tablets were given, Moshe prayed to God, we should be forgiven. We're reinstated. We're given the second set of tablets. God said, but now that because you served idolatry, our relationship is going to be through a medium. What's the medium? The medium is called the Mishkan. Make for me a Mishkan, and I dwell in your midst through the medium called Mishkan. I no longer dwell directly in your midst because you're no longer worthy of that direct relationship. It's through the medium. That's the concept of the Mishkan. Now, if we read about the Mishkan, the specifications and the materials are so exact, and if it's built or formed or developed differently, it's not valid. It's not a valid domicile for God's presence to dwell there. What does the Torah say? That the Mishkan is the source of all blessing for the Jews and for the whole world. So the Mishkan is a location which is so specific and so exact, you can't have more finite than the Mishkan. And yet, although it's so finite, God's presence dwells there. If blessing has no relevance to it, how does God dwell there? And if God could dwell there, how does blessing emanate from there? If the principle is something which is finite, which means it's been quantified, which takes on a physical profile, blessing has no relevance to it. And the Mishkan, not only does it have the basis for blessing, it is the location for God's presence. That's my question. So what I said was, which is the correct understanding, the Mishkan itself, first, what was the basis for the Mishkan? What was the blueprint? The blueprint was the fiery blueprint, which Hashem had shown Moshe in heaven. This is the blueprint. It has to be built to meet the specifications of this blueprint. Okay? This is so many cubits, that's so many cubits. And this is the area, and this is the function. You couldn't be more specific, down to the smallest detail. Does it really make a difference to God whether it's this cubit or this material or that material? For God's presence to dwell there, that should be the medium to have a relation with God. So what's the answer? All the things in the Mishkan are only symbolisms, representing things on a higher plane that we can't relate to. I want to ask the question. The Torah speaks at length about Avraham Avinu's life, that he was the pillar of loving kindness, tells us about him, how initially, how he came upon the truth of God's presence, how he gave his life, it's alluded, he was thrown into a kiln, how he was the test that Abraham was tested by God, how he becomes the founding father of the Jewish people. He fathers Yitzchak miraculously, his wife becomes fertile, so on and so forth. We speak of Yaakov. From the time in utero, twins, and there's the struggle between good and evil. Yaakov is the man of the tent of Torah. Esau is the hunter. The birthright stolen. He has to flee. Lengthy story, narrative. He works 14 hard years for his wives. He has his children. Yosef sold to Egypt. Oh, the whole story. We flesh it out. Yitzchak, we barely know anything about him. Yitzchak is a patriarch, no different than Avraham is a patriarch, and Yaakov is a patriarch. Yitzchak is the father of what? Of Yaakov and Esau. But we know very little about him. All we know that he was the object of the Akedah, brought as an offering, and God said the last moment, withdraw your hand. And then we know at the age of 40 he was married. Till the age of 60, his wife was barren, they had no children. And then we speak about how he was hoodwinked by his special son Yaakov to take the birthright that was rightfully his. That's basically all we know about him. And we know he's the son of Avraham. I mean, just as the Torah fleshes out through the narrative of Avraham and tells us about his life, why doesn't the Torah tell us similarly about Yitzchak's life, as it tells us about Yaakov's life? What's the answer? It's difficult. The ignorant person learns the story. Yitzchak was duped by his wife because his wife knew the true story. She never shared it with her husband. Yaakov, his favorite son, the special son, goes and pulls the wool over his eyes. if you understood what's going on here, you'd understand at a whole different level. But as I say, the person who doesn't have an understanding misreads it and doesn't even relate to what Yitzchak was. So why doesn't Torah let the Torah be more obvious and more specific and tell us who he is? That when you read the narrative, you understand who Yitzchak was, that he was worthy to be the patriarch and to have that special relation with God. Now, the Rambam writes in the laws of the Yesodei Torah, the fundamentals of Torah, that in the realm of angels, the 10 echelons of angels, and each one has a specific classification. We refer to some of them in the Kedusha. We speak about Ophanim, Seraphim, Seraphites, Chayes HaKodesh, different angels, 10 levels. The angel who's the least of the 10 is called Ishim. Ishim, because he has relevance to the human being. He brings the communication to the human being when the prophet prophesizes. After I give you all these various labels, 1 through 10, this is greater, this is less, this is that. Do you begin understanding for a moment what it's all about? It's fact. Could you have an appreciation for what that means? We have no relevance to it. Because we don't have an understanding of what the spiritual realm is, because we're physical beings. As much as we study, as much as we try to give equivalent examples, it doesn't suffice. Because it's something removed from our senses and existence. It's not to be described, to be understood as it should be understood. Now, of the 3 patriarchs, what attribute of God did Yitzchak represent? He represented the attribute of justice, exactness. Justice is exacting. Chesed is indiscriminate kindness. Rachmi, mercy, is exact for what you deserve, but it's doled out differently. God has patience. He allows the person to do tshuva. He'll give the punishment partially. He'll tolerate even a misbehavior, even though you're not perfect yet. But ultimately, there's reckoning for everything. That's Rachman. And Yaakov lived his life this way, within the context of Torah. Yitzchak lived his life like an angel. Could you describe to me what an angel is? You can't describe his name. You can say he is the equivalent of that. But what he is, we can't grasp it. If you're Avram, you could grasp who he is. If you're a prophet, you have relevance to understand what that is. Because a prophet, an angel communicates to him. If you're Yaakov, the most special of the patriarchs, he understood who his father was. But we have no relevance to even understanding. So what was Yitzchak? Yitzchak, we know, was the equivalent of his father and his son. He was a patriarch. How do we know? So there's no Chaim HaKadosh says something phenomenal. Sometimes a vav represents and. Vav is a connecting letter. The portion of Toldos speaks about the progeny of Yitzchak and Rivka. It says Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak, and this is the Chronicles of Yitzchak. And we finish with Yaakov, and then we have and. The and connects Avram to Yitzchak and Yitzchak to Avram. If you want to understand who Yitzchak is, you can't. But if you want to understand what dimension of spirituality was, he's no less than his father. That's what that and represents. And also. But what does the also mean? We have no idea what that means. So therefore, what was Yitzchak? You looked at him, he looked like a human being. But what was contained within that human being? What was his level of representation? It's all like symbolisms. The Mishkan itself, the specification, the exactness, for it to activate spiritual forces, it must be those various criteria and material-wise, specification-wise. But these are only symbolisms of something that exists in a much higher plane, in the unlimited plane. Except since it had to be created in this world, you have to create it with specific finite reality. But what is it? It represents the unlimited. And because it represents the unlimited, except we don't understand why or how, therefore it's the location for the unlimited, for the infinite to dwell there, for God's presence to be there. All blessing emanates from there. But a person has 1,000 bushels of wheat, 1,000 bushels of wheat, as they said, whatever way you try to evaluate it, it is what it is. 1,000 bushels of wheat is wheat. The Mishkan is not just an edifice that has phenomenal, creative, and beautiful vessels within it, which dimensions. Those dimensions are only symbolisms of something in the unlimited realm. Therefore, God's presence is there, and it generates all blessing to the world. Emanates from there, from the Mishkan, for that reason. Tefillin that we wear on our arms and wear on our heads. The parchments that are inserted in the tefillin, 4 compartments in the shel rosh. In the one, it's one compartment, and it's all written on one piece of parchment. In the tefillin we wear on the head, it's 4 separate compartments, and each compartment has another parchment. Same portions, and they have to be inserted in a specific order. And if they're not inserted in that specific order, the tefillin are not valid. And they have to be sewn with gut of a kosher species. And the symmetry of the tefillin has to be exactly square. It has to be black. Why? If you need a vessel to contain the, they're in there. And does it really make difference which parchment precedes which? Yes, the answer is yes. It makes difference it's square or not exactly square. It makes a difference if it's black or it's not fully black. Why? Because all these various aspects of the mitzvah are only symbolisms that represent something on a higher plane. So the tefillin, you look at them. What are they? It's a leather box. Parchment's written on parchment. A scribe had inscribed Hebrew words on it. And so on and so forth. These are only symbolisms. Of Yitzchak, we can't understand who he is. All we can say is he's the equivalent of his father. And Avram, that the Torah writes the narrative who he was. That's sufficient. So when we have that connecting Vav and Yitzchak is within the realm or the classification of his father. Somebody once came to Rebbe Yoshev, who was the leading decider in the world, one of them. And he asked him, it's known, the Talmud tells us, there are 36 hidden tzaddikim in this world. We don't know who they are, 36 hidden tzaddikim. Rav Shach, was the Rosh Pontific Yeshiva. He lived till 107 years old. And he was the leading Torah sage in the world. World renowned. So they came, this person comes to Rebbe Yoshev, asked him a question. How's it possible that Rav Shach is not one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim? How's it possible? Somebody greater than him. But he's known. So if he's known to the world to be that tzaddik, so that means he can't be one of the 36. But how could he not be one of the 36? He's equivalent, greater than maybe the hidden tzaddikim. So why isn't he one of the hidden tzaddikim? If the greatest tzaddikim are hidden. That question was asked to Rebbe Yoshev. So Rebbe Yoshev answered, the way you understand the devoutness and righteousness of Rav Shach is at a very superficial level. What he truly is concealed. So factually, he is one of the 36. What you understand is a semblance of the reality. But the reality is beyond. What you see a physical edifice, the Mishkan. Exacting workmanship, which is one of a kind. Material, which is one of a kind. But that's not what it is. This is only symbolisms. It represents things. Therefore, it has relevance to blessing. Everything in existence emanates from God. God willed there should be water. The water should separate. The dry land should be seen, vegetation, everything. God said, let there be. Let there be fish, insects, teeming, so on and so forth. How did it happen exactly? Well, God released an energy. That energy went through many levels of processing, of evolutions, and it came to be the ant, the worm, the mosquito, the flea. But the source of the flea and every species that exists, what's its root? Where does it emanate from? There's a continuous energy flow from the spiritual to the physical, which allows that to function exactly as it functions. That's all included within the energy. The DNA, the shape, everything is within that energy. And it manifests itself in the physical. Do we have any understanding how that process works? God said, let there be, and it was. You know, we're not talking about chas v'shalom hocus pocus. You know, abracadabra, Larry's at this year. That's a pretty good miracle. It's not so simple. God somehow coaxed him and gave him an interest. That's what he's at this year. So it's concealed. We don't know why. He made a decision. Well, why did he make a decision? He himself doesn't even understand why. Well, he was curious. He was interested. But what about the staying power? That's something else. All these things are hidden. We have no understanding. So that God, the world itself, what did God do for the sake of concealment? He went and he took this energy, he turned it into something which has no semblance of its holiness, to turn it into the mundane and the physical and the earthy, for us to be in a setting that now we have challenges. You see the animal. Do you take it to the country fair and win the prize? Or you take that animal and consecrate it and bring it as a sacrifice? What do you do with your money? Do you invest it in material and only physical amenities and comforts? Or do you invest it in the spiritual world? So people could study Torah or pay salaries or feed the poor. Well, it's altruistic. It's more than altruistic. We're not studying Torah. People say it's backward, it's archaic, it has no relevance any longer. Okay? That's what you say. God says different. God says differently than you say. What fuels existence is that Torah itself. It's like a person says, you flick the switch, the lights go on. What do we need? Oil. What do we need? The computer. What do we need? Anything. You just put the switch and it goes on. How's that person speaking? What level of understanding? He speaks like a person who was born without brains. That's the way the man speaks. You just flick the switch and the light goes on. I prove it. But he doesn't realize what's behind that switch and what's behind the generators and the power station. And how do you get the fuel? It's an endless trail you have to follow to get back to the source. Now, if you put every step in place, now you have, when you flick the switch, the lights go on. That's exactly the world. We breathe. We oxygenate our blood, the way the body works. But why does it work that way? Because we're a model in the spiritual realm that God wills that function, therefore it functions the way it's supposed to function, as it does function. And that's the reality. But why did God somehow conceal this unlimited level of genius The human body, it's a level of genius, nothing compared to it. Because it's not describable. Everybody agrees, medicine doesn't understand the makeup of a cell, of an atom. They understand it is that if you do this is the result of it. But the genius that went in to create, to bring that about, it's not fathomable. You can't in any way quantify it or relate to it. We just follow the moves and the motions. If you do this, you put a match to something which is combustible, it burns. Why does it burn? It just does. The scientist is more sophisticated. He give you a whole background. But when you get down to the basics, but why this and not that? Because it's just his reality. But why is that the reality? Because God willed the reality. But why did God will this reality and not in the other context, that reality doesn't exist? You know what the answer is? Only God knows. But it has to do with the spiritual realm, because all this here is the playing field for the challenges. So God minimized his obviousness. And there's an expression which is used today, lahavdil. He dumbed down the spirituality because he's dealing with a dummy group, and therefore you have the book for the dummy who uses the computer. Right? That's what it is, lahavdil. Because it's not comprehensible. But he made it not comprehensible because that's to create the challenge. And we have choice. You go in either direction. So he created all the evil and everything, only we should be in a position that despite the ambiguity of life and the grayness of existence and experiences, you see through all that fog and through that smog, and you can see the truth, and you'll choose to live your life within the truth that God set forth. However, the different levels of existence, as I said, there's the inactive. There is the plant kingdom. There's the animal kingdom, the reptile, the animal, the fish. The human being is the ultimate, the speaking species. The creativity of the human being, what he's able to bring about, what he's able to understand, it's beyond impressive. There's a story, very interesting story. You know, in Europe, there were many Jews who they were geniuses, but they couldn't pursue any secular education. Why? Because the universities in Europe were anti-Semitic, and they would not allow Jews to attend university, like in Russia, unless it was something out of the ordinary. Very few Jews attended, not because of their religion, not because they were observant. They wouldn't allow. It's like in the United States in the 50s and 60s, there was a quota on Jews going to medical school. Even if you passed the exam and you met all the prerequisites for medical school, you couldn't go to medical school. There was a quota of how many Jews go to medical school. In Europe, there was less than a quota. They weren't admitted. It was the exception. 1 in 100,000, maybe they would take, maybe less. Anti-Semitism. That's what it is. So there was this person who was born in Europe. He went to Israel. And in the early 70s, he was already a man, already in the 60s. He never got married. He was about 5 feet tall. And he studied in the 30s in the Hebron Yeshiva, famous yeshiva in Israel. And he was known as a genius. He was a little man, maybe 5 feet tall, slightly hunched. He had a hook nose. He had all the characteristics of a Jew, the nose, the everything, the ears. And he wore a small brimmed hat. And he came to Baltimore, and he authored some works, Torah works, because he was a genius. And how did he support himself? he had a wealthy relative in Chicago who used to support him. So one time we hosted him for Shabbos in 1972. He was at our house in Shabbos when I was living in Baltimore in the city, not out at the Yeshiva campus. And he tells us a story. He was a real character, this person. There's no question why he wasn't married, although he was in his early 60s. And he says, when he went to visit his relative in Chicago, he traveled on the subway, but it's an L. It travels above ground. It's called an L, elevated subway. So, this person always carries two briefcases with him. What's in these briefcases? It's his novelette that he wrote on the Talmud. Like a person carries his personal effects with him. He used to carry these two briefcases. Sits on the train. Who sits next to him? A man even older than him. And they start getting into a conversation. And he wasn't a Jew. He's an architect. And as they're traveling, the train is going through the business district in Chicago. The architect says, "You see that building? I designed that building. You see that building? That's my design." And he's priding himself. So he says, this little guy says to this architect, this non-Jew, says, "Mister, I gotta tell you something. You see what I have in these two briefcases? It's more than your skyscrapers and more than all you ever did. What I built here, the blueprint, surpasses whatever you have." This is what he tells the guy. Tells this non-Jewish architect. The man thought he was out of his mind. What do you have? What do you have to show for your life? He has his novelette on the Talmud, on the Torah, and he's telling him, "What I have is more than all these skyscrapers are worth." In truth, it's the truth, because the Torah itself has infinite worth. It is that. Everything when we speak about a cow goring a bull or vice versa, damages, all these laws are only symbolisms which relate to our spirituality, what advances our spirituality, what diminishes our spirituality. But God brought it to a level of concealment. You have to extract that core, which is spiritual, to have relevance and understand how it touches upon our spirituality and upon our eternity.